I want to welcome you to the I'm not exactly sure. I want to tell you, I don't know exactly what to call this anymore because it's something that's never happened, we never did before. Anyway, we're going to talk about the new NAFTA, getting down to business today. I'm Richard Alm, and I'm one half of the Texas Economic Freedom Project in the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom over here in the Cox School of Business. The center conducts research on why some economies grow and prosper and others struggle and languish. We study Texas because, first, it teaches valuable lessons about why some state economies are doing well and others aren't. Second, because we live here. And third, because we've noticed that Texans just love to hear about themselves and talk about themselves. This evening is an experiment of sorts. We are bringing together in one room the O'Neill Center's 6th Texas Economic Forum and the latest in a series of Texas Law Book continuing legal education events. For the second time in the past 6 months, the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center has joined us to co-sponsor the Texas Economic Forum. The first was last October when we released Texaco, the Texas-Mexico economy and its uncertain future, an essay I wrote with Mike Cox. He's right here if you want to talk to him about it. And he's my colleague, and he's a leader of the Texas Economic Freedom Project. In a little sense, this event was born from October's Texas Economic Forum on the Texaco report. Negotiations on the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the proposed successor to NAFTA, had concluded a few weeks earlier, and the audience had lots of questions about just what it meant for business and the economy. We didn't have many answers. The text of the New Deal hadn't even been released yet. Today, the Texas Mexico Center is co-sponsoring this Texas Economic Forum and providing our moderator, Luisa de Rosal. In a former life, I was a newspaper reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and in the early 1990s, it was part of my job to cover the NAFTA negotiations, the deal that came out of it. I read the agreement's entire text, and I understood very little of it. Good reporter that I was, I went and asked the experts, and they patiently explained things to me. Parenthetically, off the subject, the people who worked for Carla Hills in the United States weren't much help. It was the Mexican negotiators who were actually more patient to explain everything to me. And that's what we're going to do today, ask the experts, not about NAFTA, but about the new NAFTA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. But where to find the experts? I've known Mark Curtin for more than 2 decades. He's a former colleague at the Dallas Morning News. About 7 years ago, he left a cushy job at a big Dallas law firm and to launch the Texas Law Book, an online publication delivering news and commentary of interest to the business lawyers in Texas. Mark knows lawyers, and not to put on the pressure on our panel today, he assures me we've got the best new NAFTA experts in the Dallas legal community. Mark, where are you? He's way in the back there, working on tomorrow's issue, I presume. Anyway, so let me introduce the panel. I have to make sure I get them in the right order. I'm going to start at the far end with Alberto de la Pena. He heads the Mexico and International Practice Groups and is a member of the board of directors at Haynes and Boone. Alberto is licensed to practice law in Mexico, Texas, and New York, with more than 23 years of experience in advising companies on doing business in Latin America. You guys just lined up exactly the way I have them here. This is wonderful.
Very compliant.
Andres Alvarez is an experienced foreign legal consultant in the corporate department at Foley, Gardere. focusing on cross-border transactional matters, both in the corporate and commercial areas. He also advises clients on international trade and customs matter. With in-house counsel experience and an MBA, he brings a deep understanding of how legal work can help further a client's overall business goals. Tim Leahy is Chief Legal Officer for AT&T Latin America. And during the discussion, he'll no doubt tell us more about the company's Mexico operations. He joined AT&T in 1990. Over a 3-decade career, he's advised a variety of the company's business units and organizations. His current duties also include legal support for AT&T's corporate communications function. And closest to me, Luisa Del Rosal. 3 years ago, Luisa became founding executive director of the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center, dedicated to creating a dialogue and sponsoring original research on key topics affecting the relationship between the two neighbors. If you want to know more about that, I think some of these are around. I don't think she brought enough, but
we ran out. They're so popular.
But we haven't run out of these, so get one. Anyway, Luis is a native of Chihuahua, Mexico, who moved to Dallas to attend SMU, and I presumably never left, because in her previous role, she worked at the Cox Business School, so we know her quite well. She oversaw strategy and development of the new global partners to engage in networking, leadership, and business development for the Latino Leadership Initiative. So Luisa, it's all up to you now.
Thank you, Rich. I really appreciate it. I want to, again, take a moment to thank Rich and Michael, who are phenomenal partners, and the work that they do for the Texas Freedom Project is really, really relevant, and we were just honored that they would focus their annual report on one, we think, the best relationship between two countries, Texas and Mexico, because Texas is the 10th largest economy in the world. So let's remember that when we're having this discussion of why Texas is so central to today's conversation on USMCA. So it really is a privilege to collaborate with such brilliant scholars. And Michael, we will take the show on the road. I promise we will take, it is our mission to really take the conversation out of Dallas and to anybody that would listen about the importance of Texas, Mexico. So thank you both for being such great partners. And Cox is the promised land. So we envy you that we're not in Cox, just in partnership with Cox at our center. And then I take a great moment to thank Jennifer Aperti, who is the program manager for the Texas Mexico Center, and who, if we are honest, does all the work. I just get to sit here and have a wonderful conversation with great legal scholars. So this is how the event was going to work. We are going to have I have a ton of questions. They're going to feed off each other, and then I'm going to open it up for questions for you from the audience for about 20 minutes. And I know drinks are going to be offered afterwards, so I know I will be sure that we're the only thing between y'all and a reception. So I will keep that in mind and keep the conversation flowing until I see people really ready to get out. So let me ask, Timothy, we were really exchanging a couple of emails on how this conversation was going to go. And brilliantly, you said, before I get into very technical questions that I was really excited about, a sub-letter about cheese that is included in the USMCA.
She did ask me about cheese.
Yes, I did. There's a side letter on cheese, people. So you were right. We should frame the conversation on what is the status of USMCA, and show of hands, who knows what USMCA is? Okay, good. I'm glad you're in the right room. So where are we with what NAFTA, USMCA, really the current status of approval? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Thanks, Luisa. But before we start, I want to admit that I, too, was once a newspaper reporter. I covered crime and politics, never treaties. But I think covering crime and politics has been helpful in this regard. I actually applied. My newspaper went out of business in St. Louis, Missouri, and I applied to the Dallas Times-Herald. That's how old I am. But I stayed in law. I went to law school instead. In any event, so here's what I want to. First, let me explain that my perspective tonight. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My perspective tonight will be a little narrow because it's all about telecom for us. It's a little bit about movies and television, but mostly our focus in Mexico is we have a wireless company, and so we care very much about that, and it's very important to us. The treaty, as proposed, is very helpful to us, and we'll talk about that. But we'll get broader than that soon. But where we are now, I get briefed on a regular basis from meetings in D.C. and in Mexico about the process. Right now, the White House is very active in lobbying, briefing the Democratic leadership in the House and working with Republicans in the Senate. It cannot the treaty cannot become effective in the United States without a majority of both chambers. It's most likely that Nancy Pelosi will not receive the bill until August, maybe September. There are productive conversations going on now, but there are some very real perspectives on the Democratic side with regard to labor rights in Mexico, with regard to pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs, pricing, and of course the things you've heard about with regard to some agricultural issues and some steel and heavy manufacturing issues and automotive issues as well. So there's a lot that has to happen. The process as written, we were joking beforehand, we sort of know what the process is in writing, and that has only a loose connection to the way it will probably play out. Okay, so in the U.S., it's supposed to be an up or down vote. Well, we know that won't be the case. We know there will be side letters, as there were with NAFTA from the 90s. The question is whether those can be reached, whether there can be a consensus as to those side letters before the process starts. If the process starts with a consensus, you can see it as a fast track process. If there's not a consensus, even though it's considered a fast track process in the U.S., it can be taken out of that process through the leadership of either chamber, which of course would be most likely be the Democratic leadership in the House. On the Mexico side, President López Obrador has a very clear majority in the legislature, needs 2/3 to get it approved, whereas in the U.S. it's just 50% or above 50%. He's been, from my point of view, he's been especially adept at avoiding this issue. He didn't sign it. Prior administration did. He's not commenting much on President Trump, even though he's had certainly many opportunities to do so. He and his administration are being very smart politically. They'll see how far the U.S. gets before they take action. In my mind, the Mexican legislature can take action relatively quickly because of the control and the popularity of AMLO right now. So you've got a situation, and I can't really comment on Canada because I don't really think about it that much. Other than hockey, I don't think about it. But in any event, you can see that it's all about the U.S. making some progress. The other countries will observe. They will not take action. Our hypothesis is they will not take action until you see some tangible movement on the U.S. side. So this feels like late fall. It may not be until next year before there's an agreement, if there is an agreement. As an additional issue, those of us who pay attention to President Trump knows that he loves confrontation. He can give a 6-month notice that he's canceling NAFTA. It's arguable whether he can do it unilaterally, but if it's arguable, he thinks he can do it. That's the way you process it in my mind. So it's very possible that if he's unhappy with Speaker Pelosi's movement, he may declare that NAFTA will be terminated or U.S. will exit from it in 6 months. And from my perspective, from an AT&T Mexico wireless company perspective, that would be very harmful because it would negatively impact the currency in Mexico. We believe that uncertainty would frighten investors, and that could create problems for the consumers, and our customers are largely consumers in Mexico. So we care about the typical common person as opposed to big business. And so you can see a lot of different scenarios that create uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes a lack of investment. So that's a lot. I've said a lot,
Right.
but I don't want to dominate this. But I mean, there's a lot of dynamics out there that make for an uncertain future.
That's really important. I think that also understanding that there really is nothing happening anytime soon. I think that people feel it's pressure, pressure, pressure. But as you said, probably nothing till August, late fall, until President Trump potentially turns up the heat and tries to withdraw. Although, if the U.S. were to try to withdraw, the NAFTA continues, right? But just with two partners.
Correct. But it has, as you know,
Yeah.
I mean, the futures of
Yeah.
Mexico and the U.S. are fairly tied.
Yeah, so it's intertwined. So I'd like to, so now that we know, kind of set the stage, Andres, Alberto, I'll go to you. So from your perspective, just still broadly, what are some of the key opportunities? Let's talk about some of the positives of this new USMCA in comparison to NAFTA, if there are positives. Do you find them?
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you for the invitation and for your center and the Texas Law Book. I think there are very good issues, actually, very positive things in the agreement that are worth mentioning. Not only it modernizes it's like having a kid 25 years later. Things grow and develop and become, technology evolves and so on, and the treaty recognizes all that and incorporates it into the document. There are plenty of good things for small business, particularly. There's a lot on small business. There are some IP, improvements, some recognition on agricultural biotech, and so on. So there are positive things in the agreement. Of course, there are also industries that are impacted. The automotive industry is the most obvious case. But other than that, I do think there are the de minimis rule on regional value content, and I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of the term, but basically, non-originating materials from the region can be up to 10% in this new draft, as opposed to 7%. So it's a little more flexible. Also, I guess this will have a good impact on small businesses. And the de minimis rule on the value on what can be brought into Mexico was increased to, I think, $170 or something along those lines, which is also good for small businesses. So I think there's plenty of good things in the agreement as right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, thank you for the invitation first. I think when we heard all these negotiations, that this was the greatest agreement ever. Right? Once you read the agreement, you see, well, it is kind of the same. It has some things that are more restrictive to trade. It's interesting that the word free trade, it is not in the title of the agreement, right? And, as Andres mentioned, there are areas that automotive that is more local, more restrictive. It doesn't really promote the free trade in rules of origin, as we will talk probably later. But in other areas, like immigration, mostly agriculture, there are a lot of things that, are kind of the same. So it was, I think the biggest thing that this agreement brings is certainty. Certainty as to the rules, certainty because there was a lot of fear that there wouldn't be any agreement, that there wouldn't be any with all the political discourse here and the political change in Mexico, there was all this fear that, we wouldn't reach an agreement. And I think, it is, again, it has some areas like dispute resolution is really, I think it was of the low keys or low things of the agreement because it's not as good as NAFTA. But, there are other areas that are better, like digital trade, for example. We didn't have a digital trade chapter in NAFTA. because there was no digital trading in the 90s. So, you know, I mean, it is a nice update, more restricted in some areas, but generally speaking, you know, I mean, with some caveats like dispute resolutions, it is still, you know, relatively similar in many things. You know, that's what I say.
So again, from the telecom perspective, there's a provision on dispute resolution that is not as clear as it could be, but it gives us some encouragement. We invested, and we invested in we bought a couple of wireless companies in Mexico that weren't doing very well and combined them, but about 5 years ago, and we've invested over $7 billion between those companies and the rebuilding of the network. So now we provide LTE to about 100 million people, and we believe we helped take Mexico from near the bottom of the list of wireless broadband to a level similar to Germany, France, and England, right? And so but the reason we did that is because there were specific constitutional reforms that protected our investment and got us in a place where we felt like we would be treated well. And the truth is, at times, investing in some countries is in a way discouraged because you don't trust that your investment will be protected. And so the constitutional reforms in telecom encouraged that and gave us a great deal of confidence. And the treaty embeds those protections in the treaty. So that gives us a view that notwithstanding any sort of political changes that might take place or revisions internal to the Mexican judiciary as to the wisdom of some of those reforms, will still be relatively protected. And in my mind, that's really helpful to the economic growth of Mexico, because wireless technology is helpful to small businesses in particular. As we've all experienced, you can swipe a card on a little device on a smartphone. And so if you're a street vendor or you're a small business owner, you can bank wirelessly, you can receive payments wirelessly, and you can make payments wirelessly. And those are things that are fundamentally necessary to start a business or to make a living as a self-employed person. So the protections that we see, which encourage us to invest, I believe are necessary for the growth of the middle class and the movement from the very poor to the middle class in Mexico. So that's, in my mind, a policy impact that's very helpful, and one of the reasons why we're so much in favor of this new treaty, USMCA, being enacted.
So let's get a little bit technical, just because you all brought it up. This dispute resolution chapter that really was at the heart of some of the major investments. And am I right, Tim? Isn't AT&T now the largest single investor, a foreign investor in Mexico? I think your investment has been one of the largest, if not the largest, in terms of commitment. So, I mean, it really talks about your buy-in, as you were saying, and important for the Mexican economy. So tell us a little bit of what were some of the specific changes that happened? Why is it not as good as NAFTA? And what could cause you worry as a company or your clients as we're looking at this dispute resolution chapter?
So from our perspective, it's better than NAFTA.
Oh, interesting.
Because the constitutional reforms came after NAFTA existed. And so they're effectively helping us compete with América Móvil, Telcel, Telmex, or the companies who have had a legal monopoly for a number of years, Telmex at least. And they're owned by a very wealthy group of companies headed by Carlos Slim, who is incredibly smart and bright and hardworking and heads up a group that is equally as impressive. So great organizations. It's not that. But when you're trying to compete with an entity that's been a monopoly or had a market share of over 70%, you need some comfort that you'll be treated well. And so that's what the rules do. And so what the treaty does is it allows us to take a private right of action under certain circumstances. Again, what's written isn't necessarily the way it's going to play out, but it gives us a sense of how it will play out. But if we believe we're being treated badly under the law as it's written, we can take action as a private party. We don't have to be dependent upon the U.S. government. Again, we don't know precisely how it'll play out, but the mere existence of that provision serves as a great discipline. Because one thing that any sovereign country wants to avoid is a third party telling it how to set policy. So the mere existence of those provisions will, in our mind, will help us get a good hearing, a fair hearing, if we ever have a dispute. Having said that, we've been treated very well by the regulator, the telecom regulator in Mexico. So the commissioners and the staff understand the value of a well-funded, advanced competitor in the wireless space.
It's very interesting.
So, the way, and that's right, in particular, the telecom industry is one of the industries that was benefited by this provision. The way it works now with NAFTA is you have, as an investor of any of these three countries investing in other country, if there's an unfair treatment, you can take the country, the state, to an arbitration, to an international arbitration. So that's kind of the current status, right? And there have been many cases where, Mexican investors in the U.S. take the U.S. government and Canadians in Mexico. So under the new agreement, first of all, there is no dispute resolution between Canada and Mexico. It is only between the U.S. and Mexico. And Canada and Mexico are regulated by the TPP, which is very similar. I will say is equivalent to what we have in NAFTA now. But between the U.S. and Mexico, there is a dispute resolution, international arbitration. But there is one caveat that you need, as a foreign investor, for example, a U.S. investor in Mexico, you need to first follow the legal procedure or the claim in Mexico until you get a final judgment, or 30 months before you can go to arbitration, except in certain industries. If you have a government contract in the telecom area, right, or in oil and gas or infrastructure, or in transportation, in those areas you don't have to wait those 30 months. So you can resort immediately to that international arbitration, and that's what Tim was talking about. So for telecom, it kind of maintains that. For other industries that are not in these areas, you will have to litigate first in the country before you resort. Now, one good thing about all these of existing investments is even if NAFTA is terminated, there is a 3-year period where you can bring NAFTA claims after its termination. So even though it will be replaced by the USMCA, existing investors can still file claims under NAFTA that are not subject to these restrictions. So,
Andres, anything to add to that in terms of dispute resolution?
No, this is the only, there are actually 3 or 4 dispute resolution procedures under NAFTA, and the only one that suffered changes was this one, the investor state. You still have the anti-dumping countervailing duty panel procedure that has been not so welcomed in the U.S., so to speak, but it's still there, and we hopefully have the commitment from the 3 parties to re-engage in that procedure that allows you to resort to a panel arbitration procedure as opposed to the courts of the country that issues this determination. And there's another one on financial services that is just the rules on how to appoint the arbitration panel. And then there's this institutional procedure panel where general disputes come into play. But this is the only one that actually suffered any modifications. It's big, but it's not that bad.
So you touched a little, Alberto, of industries just we see here in telecom. It's actually much better for AT&T and anybody in that industry. Are there some industries that fared better under this agreement, like telecom, or some that really suffered under USMCA? What can we expect? Tell us a little bit more.
That's hard to tell, but one, and Andres, I think you're going to talk about automotive, but automotive sector is the one that I will say suffer the most in the agreement. One area that is, I think, interesting talking about, is the labor area, right? And there are 2 things. One are the rules of origin on the automotive sector we will discuss. But the other area is just general labor regulations. There is a specific commitment on Mexico about collective bargaining agreements. And the issue there is right now in Mexico, historically, because the way the legal system works, there has been a lot of cases where unions go to companies and call for a strike if they don't get certain benefits, even though they don't have the representation of the employees. And just by calling for the strike, if there is no agreement with the employer and they start the strike, they can stop the operation of the company. And you can go a legal procedure to kind of demonstrate and show that that union doesn't have the representation, but that may take months. And in the meantime, you have your operation stalled. So what it has happened in practice, particularly for small, medium companies, they have white unions, unions that are friendly with the employer, that the employer contributes to the union. Many times the employees doesn't even know they have a union. And that union is there just in case one of these bad unions come and try to claim the collective bargaining agreement. So then the white union says, I have this representation, so they cannot interrupt the activity. So with this new agreement, I think the United States claims, you say, we have very strong unions here. So you should have the same there. So this is an unfair play. So one of the commitments is that there's got to be a legal amendment in Mexico to, first of all, obviously protect the right of association, but to enforce the collective bargaining. And it will prohibit any involvement of the employers with the collective, with the unions. It will require that all the employees have a copy of the agreement, that they vote for the union, that there is a third party that verifies that all these mechanisms are complied with. So there is no cheating of any kind. And really what is behind is that push from the U.S. to say, if we have strong unions here, you should have them there. And I think that's going to affect all industry. I mean, everybody doing business in Mexico is going to be affected, unless you're a super huge company. And I don't know, probably think this, I don't know, that will be interesting to hear. This is something that may or not affect you, but depending on the type of union you have. But usually, particularly with medium-sized, small companies, they will be affected by this.
Yeah, so let's hear about it. That's because it's interesting, because I want to hear more, like, who's going to really enforce this, given rule of law in Mexico? I mean, if we're honest, who's enforcing this?
Well, so my observation, first of all, we actually have a white union as well, but we're preparing for more what we would consider an American-style union. We're heavily unionized in the U.S., so we can deal with that. That's not a big problem for us. But so this is one of those situations where the politics are remarkably aligned. Just think about it this way. Trump became president because he attracted blue-collar workers in Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. They are sympathetic to any provision that makes it more expensive to build a car or make steel in Mexico. Trump needs Nancy Pelosi to pass the treaty, to take the treaty through the House. She cares about expanding the universe of unionized workers. And we now have a new president in Mexico who has been very specific about his affection and support for working people and the poor, and has already imposed some minimum wage requirements thus far in his administration. So he certainly would support this provision. So this feels like it's happening, and it will be enforced. This is the easiest issue there is, right? The only losers are major corporations who don't have unions.
Andres, like you seem to have something to. I can't wait to hear this.
Actually, presumably, will be very good for the employees
worker, yeah.
in the country. It's going to get, presumably, the bad unions are going to disappear, and unions will have effective representation of their employees, which is what the right to
Freedom of association, right to protest.
it's about. Mm-hmm. So I hope it works, because this white union thing for some of our American and Canadian colleagues sometimes is hard to explain. It's a concept that is not easy to explain.
But for major Mexican companies, how is this going to work? I mean, when they
Well, they
really
have to go through the transition because I remember one time we had a case of a U.S. company that was doing business in Mexico. It was mostly administrative work. So they have an office in Santa Fe with 30 employees, all administrative, no workers, and then they got one of these unions. The employees didn't even want the union, and they called for the strike, and they had to close the office for like 3 months. So, that's why this prompt these schemes of why unions. And I think it is part of the mainstream in doing business in Mexico. There is no single business unless you're in a very specific industry that has very strong unions. In the mining sector, you are captive. But I think this is going to affect all the companies, and they have to go through that transition. And I think the question is whether this is going to, as Andres said, really benefit the workers or not, right?
Let's talk about other, since Tim, this reform not only was on energy in terms of telecom, it was on energy. So I'd love to hear y'all's perspective because I, again, value AT&T's investment. But when you talk to some energy companies looking, especially Texans looking at investing in Mexico, they fear the lack of rule of law. They fear they don't have some of the wherewithal and strength that AT&T did have to go in. So I'd love to hear the side letter on energy, your thoughts. We're in Texas. Texas energy is, the thing. So love to hear your perspectives on the energy side letter and what we can expect given AMLO and his. I'm going to throw a wrench there given President Andres Manuel López Obrador, and we don't really know his thoughts on energy today.
I'm just going to be brief. And
they change.
It's kind of hard to tell. But everyone was expecting an energy chapter in this agreement. There is no energy chapter in NAFTA because, the energy was close to the state at that time in Mexico. So there is one side letter, as Luisa mentioned, that relates is between the U.S. and Canada. And that really is just to grant access to the transmission lines and kind of on the regulatory side, not to have any obstructions to the access to the pipelines and, that kind of stuff. There is no energy chapter or anything related to Mexico. There is Chapter 8 that I brought it. This is Chapter 8. That was included presumably because the incoming administration of AMLO wanted to include. And it just pretty much repeats what the Mexican Constitution says. And it says that Mexico reserves its sovereign right to reform its constitution and legislation. And Mexico has the direct, imprescriptible ownership of all hydrocarbons in the subsoil of the national territory, which is what, right now the law says that, the hydrocarbons on the ground are owned by the state. Once they are extracted, they can be owned by private parties. So it is interesting that there is not only, I think the short answer is that I don't think this agreement changes anything on energy. There is no change at all. But people were expecting to have protection of the energy reform, Mexican energy reform here, to be included here. So if the new government of AMLO wanted to reverse it, you not only have any challenge domestically, but on the protections of the agreement, right, to have this protection. But there is no protection particularly to this, Yeah.
So where it boils down to the current political climate in Mexico on the energy side, that's what it is. And it's uncertain, and we'll have to see what happens. Fortunately, when the energy reform was passed by Congress a few years ago, the myriad of legal of changes in the different statutes in the country was done. So AMLO, Andres Manuel López Obrador, he has the power to amend all of these, but that would have to be done if something significant, he wants to do something significant in the energy sector.
One thing, and just to add to what Andres said, what is happening right now, in fact, is that it has been slowing down the reform. There are no more auctions from the upstream side. They have not canceled any agreement, but I think they try to strengthen Pemex and CFE, so most of the business will probably go back to service agreements. They have even stalled also the farm outs of Pemex. So it looks like, and it has been publicly said by the president that they don't want this neoliberal regime that changed all this, and I think they want to go back to the policy where Pemex and CFE were doing most of the stuff. One claim that he has made, and some analysts said it's a valid claim, is that with all the upstream bids that were won by private companies, there has not been so quick investment and production, and there has been some speculation. I don't know if that is true or not, but
It's a valid point. Tim, you were saying you had an immediate reaction to my doubtfulness of where the president stands. Do you have insider knowledge?
So I don't have insider knowledge on this at all. But you can't help but do business in Mexico without thinking about energy. And the reforms were parallel to the telecom reforms. And why did one work and why did the other one not work? And what I would suggest is as strange as it sounds, natural resources are personal and wireless is invisible. So much of the country's pensions and other aspects of its wealth is tied to natural resources in Mexico, whereas wireless is new and different. And therefore, if we get licenses and we start to spend money and we put up towers, it's very rare that anyone would suggest socializing a wireless network. Or nationalizing, I should say. Whereas there's a long history in the Middle East, certainly, of oil companies from Europe or the United States coming into the Middle East and building the infrastructure and then extracting great wealth, and then the country eventually believing that they should own those resources. So there's a lot of history there that makes it different.
I like the way you said it's personal, natural resources. Another thing that's very personal is our cars. I think so. I really love my car. It has a name, it has a color, it's SMU. So I say this because I just loved Tim's perfect segue. Let's talk. The last question I really want to ask is the automotive sector. And Andres, I know you know a lot about this topic. This is, again, should be really personal. Our cars are going to be more expensive from my perspective. So I'm going to pay more if I want to change blue.
Probably yes. Yeah.
Tell us more. Like what for all of us that don't have Chapter 8 with us or other chapters printed. Tell us more about what this audience should know about those Jeep, because that's one of the biggest lobbies in the U.S. that actually was against some of the changes.
And it's probably one of the hardest fights in the agreement with the automotive industry. And it's a nightmare. I mean, rules of origin by themselves are arid and tedious and hard. And when it comes to the rules of origin of cars, given the myriad of components that these personal items have on themselves, you can imagine it's big. And what they did was they introduced a specific rule of origin for each component or each of the major components of the cars. And on top of that, they increased the actual, regional content that the car should have. And on top of that, they say, now if you want this to qualify as regional, you have to source all your 70% of your aluminum and steel from the region. And on top of that, you have this 60-hour, labor wage situation. So basically, probably the cars will get more expensive. Whether companies will implement these rules of origin to have their cars be originating for the region or not, from the region or not, it's a bottom line, a business decision, a cost-benefit analysis. If it turns out that once implementing these rules, the cost will be much higher than just paying the most favored nation rate, they will bring them without, complying with origin rules. I think it's as simple and complex as that. Yeah.
was really well, I've had the most fun. So now I'm going to let you all ask these brilliant minds some questions. Oh, well, there's a side letter on cheese. And I think that side letter is for Canada specifically, right? Am I correct? For the U.S. Okay, tell me about the side letter on cheese. Who wants to take this? I just saw that it existed and could not stop laughing.
There are two. I mean, there are some.
There are two letters, people, on cheese.
There's a Swiss cheese and a what?
And cheddar.
And cheddar.
Of course.
Please. Yeah. Well, so Mexico has made some commitments with the European Union about cheeses. The geographical indications, so the mozzarella cheese comes from the mozzarella region, I guess. I don't know. So a lot of, so one of the issues was how Mexico imports 75% of the cheeses from the U.S. So, a lot of those cheeses come packaged as mozzarella, Swiss, blue cheese, that most of them, they have been made in other parts of the world. So there's this side agreement where Mexico will accept that they could continue buying and importing from the U.S. with those denominations, even though, Mexico has other type of arrangements, and it's a very complicated, I think, legal logic that they use to get to that side letter, be compliant with the commitment that separately Mexico has with Europe.
Fascinating. Cheese.
Those things are
These are the things that matter when we're talking of cross-border trade,
So what I'm hearing about is you care about cars and cheese.
basically. Don't we all? There'll be cheese outside probably, so we'll know. Will they fit the side letter? Okay, we're gonna start with questions. There are microphones. You have to go to a microphone for the question. So to the gentleman to the left who has already arrived at the microphone, I'll give you the first one. And we have about 20 minutes for questions. Yes, 27 minutes.
Right, so I was a voter in 1992, and I remember Ross Perot criticizing the NAFTA as creating a giant sucking sound of jobs to Mexico. And I think 30 years later, the perception was that that actually happened. He was not only colorful, but correct. Does this new USMCA address that issue either explicitly or structurally? Will it alter the incentives to relocate jobs to Mexico?
I mean, I think on depends.
Microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. I think it depends. I mean, Can you hear me? There are some sectors like the automotive that Andres was referring to, that they have now the requirement that in 5 years, 40% of the cars needs to be produced by workers making $16 per hour. And I think that's going to be very remote that happens in Mexico, with currently the daily wage is $5 per day. So, and on the board is $8. So I think that was meant to move that labor force to the U.S. I think the question is whether the auto companies will do that, or will just export those cars somewhere else, right? And they will continue producing in Mexico. They won't comply with our rule of origin, and they will export those to the U.S. I think right now the tariffs for the importation of cars that don't comply is around 2.5%. So if that's the case, that will increase the cost that Andres was also mentioning. But again, I think it depends by the sector. I think, on the automotive is where probably you may see some movement of that labor force to the U.S., I guess.
So if I might quote some of the research from our center. So something we found, because we were really curious about this idea, given that there was this new perception of all over the country that, NAFTA had, the giant sucking sound, right? The jobs had left. So we did a study just focusing on Texas. So this is true only in Texas. I can't say it's true anywhere else because we didn't look at the data anywhere else. But what we found is that before NAFTA existed, we did see from Texas actually several jobs flee to Mexico because it was cheaper. But thanks to NAFTA and the production units that were created because of freedom of trade and freedom of services, and because things cross the border 7 times, things like auto parts, what we found is in Texas is we can statistically prove that after NAFTA, actually workers from Mexico and Texas became complements and not substitutes. So basically, every time a job was created in Mexico, actually one created in Texas. So we were never displacing, at least Texas and Mexico, ever since NAFTA. So USMCA hopefully will continue that for Texas. We're interested in seeing, is that true for the rest of the country, given some of the political perceptions. But at least our research found that in Texas, any jobs that were lost were automation more than people replacing each other. It was more complementary than anything, which was great in terms of, again, the Texas economy. And it was really because of the Texas economy and the freedom of business in the Texas economy. So I'm not sure that would be true in all states. But to us, it was a clear demonstration that, again, free trade and freedom of business helps with this creating jobs and jobs being here. It was more about that than anything else, than restrictions or barriers that would promote creation of jobs in Texas. So I'd love to hear any.
So I'm really hesitant to even comment, because in my mind, the framework we should bring is, yes, do jobs leave the U.S., but where do they go? And obviously some may go to Mexico, but the value of a North American treaty is that it builds a ecosystem that can compete with the Pacific Rim. To me, that is the fundamental benefit of a treaty that's substantively, directionally, helpful. Because where manufacturing exists, research and development exists. And where research and development exists, wealth gets created. And so you buy an Apple phone, the intelligence is in Northern California, the manufacturing is overseas in the Pacific Rim. You'd love it if the manufacturing were somewhere in the North American trade area. That may not really happen because of the nature of electronics and just the way things are moving, but the more you can draw manufacturing to a region, the more likely you'll get research and development in that region, the more likely you'll have engineers in that region, and that's where wealth is created. It's the ideas that lead to manufacturing that creates wealth. But I'm not an economist, so that's why, this is just my view.
Look at the Texaco report that Michael Cox did, and more of this is answered. Okay.
So my question is, linked to that last comment you made, Tim, and getting us back to cheese and who moves whose cheese, and it's digital cheese, right? Data. So what's your opinion on, and not just for you, Tim, but everybody, on what are the benefits of data and where can it be stored, where can it be worked at, right? Especially compared to, Asia and especially China that's eating our cheese, right? And,
Are you talking about like intellectual property data or like privacy
like
issues?
where data resides, right? You talked about smartphones, and there's a lot of data that's generated with applications, and where can that data be stored, and where can it be worked at to generate that value that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Analytics, and how are we going to use them, right?
Really, really good question. And so I think the challenge is, how do you regulate, or how would a government regulate the exchange of data? And does it try to do what Europe has done, which is try to limit the location so it doesn't get exported? The challenge, of course, is, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well, maybe not. When I go to Mexico, I get on ESPN.com and I get the Spanish language Mexican-centric ESPN. And then when I come back to Dallas, that's what I still get for about 2 days. So I watch soccer. Yeah, that's all you watch, which is great, actually. So I'm really humble. I think we all need to be really humble about the ability of governments to control the flow of information. We should hesitate to encourage governments to do that. But I'm not even sure that the government can figure out how to do so given technology as it exists today. We all know that if you get on the internet, you don't know where that server is. And so we could probably talk all night about that. I do believe very deeply that we have to be cautious that certain countries do not share the fundamental sense of personal privacy that you see in, frankly, the Western Hemisphere. I mean, and that's really important because you get into governments drawing data out about people individually, hacking in and then using that information for geopolitical advantage. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, though.
Actually, the agreement has some provisions about movement of data, and it does not restrict, as long as it's a party to the agreement, the US, Canada, or Mexico, it doesn't restrict where the data can be stored. And the digital trade chapter does provide some, privacy protection issues, but, not limited, but subject to whatever the governments want to do with their statutory protection of privacy, which boils down to whatever current legislation on privacy, which I think is good, it's in Mexico in place, or in the US, or in Canada. So that I got a little bit more specific to your question.
Okay, next question.
First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Douglas George, the new Consul General of Canada in
Welcome.
Texas, and a longtime trade negotiator. I'll try and ask. I do want to talk to you about cheese, but that'll
I can't
be
wait.
later.
Can't wait to see how many people come talk to me about cheese.
One of the complications in the NAFTA negotiations was that partway through the negotiations, the U.S. introduced tariffs on steel and aluminum, ostensibly for national security purposes. Now, personally, I think it's absurd, but I've heard a lot of other words. They were quite obviously there to put pressure on their two biggest suppliers of steel and aluminum, Canada and Mexico. We, being unfailingly polite in Canada, returned the favor and put tariffs on $12.8 billion worth of U.S. exports of steel, aluminum, and other things like that. Now that the agreement is there, these are still in place. And as you heard on the rule of origin, steel and aluminum is part of the rule of origin on autos. Do you think that NAFTA 2.0, which is called the CUSMA in Canada, and TMEC in Mexico, so I'll call it NAFTA 2.0, do you think it could proceed while these tariffs are still in place, or do you think this is something that's going to have to be dealt with politically before that happens? Thank you. Merci. Gracias.
Thank you for being here, Consul General.
There was an article, I think Associated Press released something a few days ago, actually saying that the Canadian Parliament may actually condition approval of the agreement to the release of the tariffs by the U.S. And there are 2 or 3 side letters dealing with this, specifically not only about cheese, and there's also one that deals with the aluminum or any executive authority increasing tariff duties to products. So, I mean, I'm of course, if we are trade partners, let's act like trade partners and let's get rid of this. Is nonsense too strong?
Not strong enough.
and let's get rid of them and start working together. So that's my point of view.
One of the interesting that Andres mentioned is on that section 232 of the Trade Act, the executive here the president can put those tariffs. I think they can go up to 25% in circumstances of emergency or national security. There are some side letters on the document that's just, I think the way they address is if the U.S. is going to impose or use that Section 232, they will give notice, and they have 60 days before they enter into force. So they have 60 days to kind of negotiate. So the U.S. will say, okay, I'm going to impose this tariff, right? And we have 60 days to go into force. And then, it will be just, I think, a matter of negotiation. So,
Michael.
Okay, I've heard a lot about how, a lot with regard to the trade agreement on how it benefits, say, Nancy Pelosi or Lopez Obrador or Trump or American auto workers, the unions, the auto industry, the labor union, the jobs in America, and so on. But I haven't heard about the main purpose of trade agreements, and that's to benefit the consumer. I mean, that's why we do this. Trade is about the consumer being, as an American, would like to buy stuff from Mexico. The Mexicans would like to buy stuff from us. And in the absence of a trade agreement, what we have is the producers in each country shutting out the products that come from the other country. It's not about producing. It's not about any of these other things. Really, it's about the consumer. So tell me about how the consumer fares, please. It's good that you're better off, but I'm a consumer. So my car is going to cost more, but I'm going to buy a Chinese car and that anything that the U.S. auto industry has ever done to try to feather their own nest has eventually caused them to lose market share. They started with 45% of market share in America in 1968. Now they have 4.5% because they tried to protect. They had involuntary import restraints from. Now they're doing it again. They're going to make their car more expensive. And in the long run, they're going to hurt themselves. And as a consumer, I'm just going to sidestep the whole show that they put on. So what about the consumer? Same question.
That's
What
a
about the
great
consumer?
question, Michael, because we're all consumers, even if we're not all workers and we're not all business owners. What we all are consumers. So that's an excellent question. So, how are the consumers both in Mexico and in the U.S. faring under this new USMCA? Tim, take it away. You go first.
So it's hard to argue with you short term, right? It's hard to. You know that there are additional costs that will be imposed into the ecosystem, and the consumers end up buying goods and services out of that ecosystem. So yes, what I would suggest is the creation of a fertile territory for the manufacturing and investment in goods and services is in the self-interest of the three countries. And admittedly, you can't be a free trader and agree with these things. So I'm absolutely 100% on board with the idea that in a perfect world, you would have no tariffs and you would have no trade treaties, no advantage based on geography. But we don't live in that world. We know that in China, the government supports particular companies for purposes of developing their national policy. I don't begrudge it, it's just different. And so if you don't acknowledge that difference, then you put yourself at a disadvantage, and slowly over time, you lose the capabilities to manufacture and develop new products and services. And so that's how I think about it. Is that there's a national strategy in China and part of what you're hearing from me is my view that intellectual property is taken in appropriately, and it's impossible to enforce or to discipline such behaviors when you're in a situation where you're dealing with different sovereign entities. So we're trying to build a fertile ground to develop and therefore enhance the wealth of consumers. Admittedly, it costs more. But by the way, it costs more to buy a soccer ball at Dick's Sporting Goods if you require that the soccer balls not be made by 8-year-olds in Afghanistan. And so maybe we have a policy in a sense that that's what we want to do. And so now we pay more for soccer balls than we might have 5 years ago. So there's a lot of imperfections that are informed by politics or policy.
Thank you, Tim. Well, that brilliant answer. I think.
No,
which is
keep
up.
going, keep
Oh,
going.
keep going. I was like, I have somebody behind me. What's going on? I felt like in the debate. I was like, what's happening? It got really real fast. It's a gentleman right here.
I just have one quick question. And is there anything in the provisions that pertain to getting the cartels less involved in Mexican politics and Mexican economy? And I mean, El Chapo recently said that they've been donating to U.S. Politicians, so hopefully our economy as well and our politicians. Is there anything in regard to that in the agreements?
There is nothing specific about that. But there is a new chapter, anti-corruption chapter, that was not in NAFTA. So there is a new chapter. It is, a lot of these conventions that Mexico and the U.S. have executed. And to be honest, when you read the chapter, part of the problem that I think Mexico has had historically is not that there is no law against corruption. It has been an enforcement issue. Mexico is part of all you name all the conventions, international conventions on anti-corruption. If you see, and in fact, I was reviewing for a client a matter this morning. If you see the Mexican statute on corruption, it's really strict. The FCPA is nothing. There is no exception about facilitating payments. Is really strict. So I think that the big challenge that you mentioned, I think for Mexico is an ongoing challenge, is the rule of law, the enforcement of the rule of law.
Okay, one question over there.
Yeah, real quick. This whole issue of side letters has bothered me since the first NAFTA. And, we pay dearly for them. And I want to know how they get approved, who approves them, when they show up, and when's the termination period. Why, if there is a need for a specific side letter, why isn't that in the agreement? Why does it have to be under the table? Why does a company like ADM have to slip it under the table? And the second thing, just out of curiosity, the new NAFTA is fixing something. What is your estimate of the top 5 things it's fixing that wasn't in the original agreement?
Okay, gentlemen, why do side letters exist?
The side letters are just, here's the deal.
I think the side letters are an attorney's dream.
Yeah. The side letters.
System of anyone involved in trade in Mexico has to get a goddamn,
No, I know. NAFTA was negotiated in 27 months.
Right.
This agreement was negotiated in 18 months. If you read the agreement, NAFTA had 22 chapters. This has more chapters. It has 34 chapters that are shorter.
Right.
If you read the new agreement, it's floppy in many ways. It is not very precise. It has all these side letters. The side letters are between just countries. So, there is a side letter between the U.S. and Mexico that is public, but it's part of the agreement, where they say, well...
There are multiple side letters, not one side letter.
No. There are, I don't know how many, but probably there are 20 or more.
It may surprise you that I'm representing a major group in Mexico, not an American company.
Well, yeah, there are many side letters. So I think it was just part of the dynamic to get a quick deal, instead of from drafting and all that, instead of getting all this, beautiful agreement, it was very pragmatic and said, well, this deal, we do it in a side letter. It is very common in M&A deals, right? You're going to get to the closing, you have all this agreement, but you don't want to mess up with something you want to change because you haven't negotiated for months.
That the key ingredients need to be changed in the first negotiation. It didn't need to wait. Who approved the side letters?
It's going to be part of the agreements, and they are approved as part of the agreement.
Got to go to the
Yes,
U.S.
that's
Congress.
go
It's
through
the whole
Congress,
It's kind of an annex of the agreement. So it is part of the separate.
On that. But anyway, on the correction of the prior agreement, what do you think? And I heard the idea about labor unions, which I don't believe will happen because the leaders of the unions in Mexico don't want it to happen. And a new American company coming in will probably have to pay the piper. But an existing Mexican company isn't going to pay the piper. He's in bed with the president of the local union. The guy gets a check and buys a new house, and things go on for the next 5 years.
Yeah, that's the enforcement issue that unfortunately we keep hinting at.
perspective, what are the 4 or 5
Top five.
major issues you think will be corrected?
Let me just add to what Alberto was just saying. John side letters are not so under the table because they're out there. I mean, and you can read them, and they deal with cheese and with mezcal and sotol and bacanora and some typical American rye whiskey and the tariffs on the executive authority and on energy between Canada and Mexico and so on and so forth. So, but I mean, I understand the concern. Why is this thing outside of the whole treaty? On the things, if I may repeat, I do think it's highly beneficial to small businesses. It has a lot. What the original NAFTA didn't have is concern for the mom and pops now that wants to build their business, and there's a lot of provisions on facilitating credit and capital and information on how to set up a business and how to pay taxes and how to hire personnel and how to deal with IP and a lot of other things in there. And there's even the countries agreed to set up a website that will direct to each country's requirements for these small businesses to come, and this is complemented by the digital trade chapter, where as Tim was saying, there's facilitation for digital trade, for financial operations online, and so on. So I think that's a big thing that probably will, I don't know, big companies, although they're consumer oriented, might benefit too because they will have a larger volume of customers, but it's in the direct benefit of the consumer, of the mom and pops. The challenge is, what is a small company in Canada and in the U.S. and Mexico, because it's not. I think that's, for me at least, is one of the main benefits in the treaty.
We've talked about a lot of things, but one thing I'll say is, it's subject to review once it's enacted every 6 years. Yeah. Actually, that's a really good piece from my perspective, because one of the challenges with any treaty is over time it builds up, it gets dated, and when the populace of any of the countries believes that it's wrong and the government doesn't change it because it can't, because it's a treaty of X number of years, that's really counterproductive. And so I think from a democratic perspective, the more frequent review is better, even though the process is extremely ugly. I mean, it's the ultimate in sausage making. You really don't want to see it. But that's kind of the way you want to have it be refreshed periodically, if only for sort of the trust of the people and the nature of technology changing.
You also have the IP, that's 3. So there are a few things, but mostly it was incorporating what has been developing for the past 25 years into this new document. As Alberto was saying, there's nothing is that new. It's just incorporating what is there: privacy statutes and cybersecurity and digital trade and IP and etc.
So I'm going to go over the last 2 questions from the gentleman here. So.
A couple of things. I mean, during the first 5 years of NAFTA, from 1993 to 2007, jobs in the United States increased from 110 to 137 million. And that is according to the Department of Labor of the United States. The GDP in the United States did increase in the first 5 years of the United States, and it has been done consistently ever since. So you check your own data, the job loss that did not happen to the rate that everybody thinks. So, and that is United States government facts. Our industry, I work in a facility that makes machines. 90% of our machine is steel. The thing that affects us the most today is the changes that the U.S. government is doing. So we are no longer competitive in Mexico. So what we have to do now is to set up a facility in Mexico to sell to Mexico, Central and South America. Because we cannot compete with the Chinese over there, because now the price of steel has increased dramatically. So the other thing that is affecting us due to the behavior of the government today, we used to send our technicians, about 80% of our productions go somewhere around the world. So we used to send our own technicians to start up the machines, and so we have a group of people, and we increase our service department to send those guys to start up the machines. due to the environment today, countries like Turkey, where you can get your visa approved at the airport, you can do it with every other country but the United States. So you have to get approval from the embassy here, and you have to do a bunch of things that it costs us most money, more time, than for us to hire a crew in Turkey that go do the job. So in reality, what is affecting us is the policy of the country that we're trying to protect. The United States wasn't self-sufficient in the steel for the past 12 years. We didn't have enough steel to supply the demand. And then you do this thing, it's even worse. So it's not helping us. People like you, the startup of the business that you guys are doing in Mexico, is helping definitely the United States. I mean, the capital is coming back to the United States. And at the same time, is helping the people in Mexico to get a job and not to end up in the drug trades. So it's really important that the commerce stays as it is and we grow with less regulation instead of more regulations. So what are we going to do on the steel and aluminum to fix that thing? Thank you.
I mean, I don't know what's going to happen there. I think is a temporary thing. But, you know, one of the things that it was mentioned is this agreement is regulated stuff that has not been regulated in NAFTA because it was outdated, right, like digital trade, IP. But the thing that it lacked, it was, I mean, this is not an agreement of integration of North America. I mean, and that would have been nice to have more integration. I remember 10 years ago, we were talking about more integration. But this is not that agreement, I think. No. This is not an agreement. Integration is an agreement that kind of keeps the status quo, is more restrictive to the free trade on some areas as automotive, and it just kind of regulates, you know, whatever has come up in the mainstream. But it is not really about getting more integration between the three countries.
Okay, the political scientist in me says the answer is in us, and we need to go vote and need to make sure we continue to vote for people who support the way of life that has gotten us here. I'm just saying that because the solutions are with us, people. Small government. Last question.
On Chapter 27, anti-corruption, given the political environment in the three countries, Mexico, U.S., Canada, I think all of them have their fair share of scandals at a very high level. Given the gaps that exist in the current laws and what the anti-corruption chapter indicates, do you sense there will be a push from the people to really close those gaps, to have, in other words, a more credible sort of anti-corruption system all across the board?
Most likely, yes. One of the major themes on López Obrador's campaign was get rid of corruption. And as Alberto was saying, Mexico has beautiful laws about everything, the environment, labor, anti-corruption, you name it. We have great laws. The problem is the rule of law, the court system, the policemen on the street. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. So the new president's campaign is based on getting rid of that. So I do think there's going to be a push to end that. Now, it's quite an endeavor, to be honest, I think. But the intention is there, and hopefully it will get there at some point.
I mean, I agree with what Andres said. I particularly don't think that the anti-corruption chapter itself is going to make a big difference, because a lot of this is driven internally. And there is this, at least this rhetoric that we have. And, it's just a matter of, I think people in Mexico are tired of this issue, because it's an issue that has come up every single election. I mean, I'm 48 years old, and since I was a kid, I heard about this. So, it is, I think people are tired of this, and hopefully this is it, hopefully.
All right.
Thank you to
We've
our
worked
amazing.
these people overtime. I get to say goodbye.
You were saying goodbye. Well, okay.
All
You
right.
thank us. Well, I just wanted to thank you.
Because you can't ask these people to applaud you. I would like to ask them to give these guys, they worked very hard.